The Life Changes Trust is privileged to have funded Loud and Clear, which charts 2 decades of involvement, voice and activism by people with dementia across Scotland. When the Trust first received the proposal, it was clear that its intention and ambition was exciting and meaningful for people with dementia. The Trust recognises the importance of capturing stories and having a record of the involvement and activism work across Scotland and the impact that it has. We're extremely grateful to everyone who's been involved in writing this truly inspirational and powerful story. And we look forward to seeing how it grows and develops and continues to influence change by people with dementia across Scotland in the future. Thank you.
Loud and Clear. Scotland, a nation of innovators, inventors and social enterprise. Scotland, a nation of doers and dreamers, a nation of poets and preachers, a nation of singers and storytellers, a nation of artists and architects. Scotland, a nation of campaigns and campaigners, a nation of activists and their actions. Scotland, the home of Dementia Activism. Hear our voices, hear our choices. Hear us tell it, loud and clear.
Loud and clear. Why tell the stories of people with dementia? For many centuries, people with dementia have been largely undiagnosed, unseen, unvalued, ignored, and disrespected, and their voices have been unheard. It is only from around the turn of this century that people with dementia start to connect with each other and make their needs and views known directly, without the medium of however well-intentioned proxies. The impetus initially comes from just a handful of remarkable individuals raising their own concerns about their rights, their place in their community, and the quality of services being provided or not for them. Further progress comes as those with the lived experience begin to meet and work with each other, making new connections, which strengthen their shared conviction that there is still hope for a kind of recovery. As one person put it, after decades of silencing and discrimination, people with dementia are beginning to join forces, take actions, and campaign for social change.
Good afternoon, I'm James McKillop. Here's a bit out of the Loud and Clear book.
Starting to make connections. After he is diagnosed, James can't find anywhere he feels welcome. He recalled, there's nowhere for people with dementia to go, to just sit and be themselves. He remembers going along to various mental health meetings after his diagnosis, looking for support, information and company.
I was ostracised from the start. Nobody would listen when I tried to explain that dementia was a mental health issue. After all, it affects the brain and it is hard to learn anything new. Everyone looked askance at me when I mentioned I had dementia. When I tried to speak, I was firmly told that dementia did not belong there and I had to go elsewhere. Nobody had heard of it, and they certainly did not want to discuss it. They had their own agendas. I was cold-shouldered. They didn't want to know me. I was a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, and I had to fight hard to get heard wherever I went. I was never asked any questions. There was simply no interest. After that, I was blanked, so I moved on from the hostile atmosphere. This was a flat reason to to later set up a group of people with dementia where we could meet and talk openly.
But soon after James' diagnosis, Brenda Vincent, a support worker with Turning Point, visits to assist him in applying for disability living allowance. Then she asks him to help at a Christmas party.
Being unaware of my condition had led to a very difficult lifestyle and family tensions, and the scars still oozed blood. I was in my own wee world, comparable to Dante's hell, completely bewildered and unable to make sense of anything going on around me.
So he really enjoys having company, and Brenda becomes a key person in his story. James reflects.
I was fortunate in meeting Brenda, who was using her own time and influences to steer me towards a fresh start in life. Brenda brought me back into the community, and I am now contributing back to society. If it wasn't for her, I would be a big burden on the state. I might still be staying behind my four walls.
Around the same time, in 2000, James became involved in a research project run by Heather Wilkinson. He also contributes to the work on the government's Learning Disability Review, the same as you. He recalls,
It was the early days, and I was still reeling from the impact of the diagnosis. I was the only voice of people with dementia at that time. I had to fight my way into these meetings. At that time, I did not know, nor did the expert, that some people with learning disabilities had a higher risk of developing dementia, such as people with Down syndrome. I went to highlight those with a newly developed dementia.
James is not named in the subsequent report. However, it contains a number of references to dementia over which he may well have had an influence. By now, Alzheimer's Scotland has initiated its candlelight support groups for people recently diagnosed with dementia. Neither the first group for men only or the second for women only lasts for more than a few weeks. It is not clear why. After some thinking and trepidation, they put on a mixed group. It is so successful that it runs for over a year, until progression of the illness and death of members eventually closes the group. James is enjoying meeting others who are in the same boat, and he recalls,
I was a member throughout and enjoyed it, but it was a support group only. We never campaigned. We visited places as a group and had lunch.
So after going through the usual depression after diagnosis, James now picks himself up and is keen to get involved and to make a difference. After a year of nagging, Brenda persuades him to do IT training, which will stand him in very good stead as he becomes an activist. But people with dementia are not yet always welcomed into public events. James remembers being turned away from a dementia conference in 2000 because he has dementia. However, Brenda drapes a large camera around her neck, and undaunted, he manages to blast his way in as an official photographer. He is actually an amateur photographer. James notes that the next year he is a speaker at the same event. Getting busy. Things now really start to change. James realises that he must choose one of the three paths to follow.
First, the status quo. I could have kept blundering around my shrunken world, deeply depressed, as I had been decisively excommunicated from a misunderstanding society. Next, I could have simply given up and been watered, fed, and lived in limbo until my dying day. Finally, I could stand up to the kitchen. How dare it think it can control me?
He opts for the third path and gets busy.
I decided to try and ensure there was material for others to clutch at in the time of need. So I go around doctors' surgeries and hospitals in my local area, leaving posters and helpline cards. I also leave them anywhere else I can. For example, in some churches, community halls, centres, and public notice boards. Nowhere is sacred. To me, it is senseless telling someone they have dementia, then leave them guessing what comes next.
In October 2000, James presents some of the findings of Heather Wilkinson's research project at an event for carers, policymakers and practitioners. He recalls,
My first talk, Heather asked me to do it. I don't know why I did it. At that time, it was unheard of. Brenda rehearsed me. I wasn't a public speaker, but then I began to get this feedback from people coming up and saying they enjoyed it. It made me see things differently and changed my mind about things. People appreciated you doing the talk and said how brave you were. It made me think I can speak for others with dementia who cannot speak for themselves. I was never a public speaker, though I had muttered the odd word at meetings like PTAs, Parent Teachers Associations. Suddenly, I was up there speaking to a group of discerning people and operating an OHP, that's an overhead projector. What on earth possessed Rebecca and Heather to allow me platform time? Where had the confidence come from to permit me to give a talk? They certainly went out on a limb, putting their heads on a chopping block if it had gone pear-shaped, and both must be highly commended for their foresight and risk-taking stance.
James's diary soon fills up with meetings about living wills, transport, dementia-friendly communities, and much more. In June 2001, he writes an article to the local paper in which he decries
hurtful, demeaning, and derogatory terms like dementia sufferers, suffering from dementia, demented, and other such like vile terms.
The article is never published, but many years later at an Alzheimer's Europe conference, James speaks about the issue, loud and clear.
And I surprised myself by my boldness.
The Central Belt isn't the only place where things are happening. Nancy McAdam from the Black Isle, previously a preschool coordinator and a community development worker in Merrifield, Glasgow, is diagnosed with dementia in 2003, following a number of strokes.
Then a CPN visited. After a couple of years, she'd had enough of me.
But Nancy and another person with dementia, Alan, connect with Sheila McEver at the Inverness branch of Alzheimer's Scotland. Nancy has always been a campaigner, or as she calls it, an oddball. She has campaigned on GM crops on the Black Isle and was arrested and held in a cell for 8 hours, and has taken part in a rent strike when the high-rise estates in Merrifield flooded.
I like to take action. I'm still up to my eyes in work. In 2007, the paper did a big middle page spread of me. I thought it was important that people realised you can keep up your CV, cardiovascular, grow veg, dig the soil. It's the cycle of life.
Nancy wrote this beautiful dementia monologue, Everything in the Garden.
So what's wrong with me, doctor? I ask. You lack vitamins in your body, he said. Eventually your mind will be affected. Like leaves falling from a plant, your mental faculties will shrivel and fail. I was alarmed. What can I do to ensure more fruitful years? I asked. I prescribe baby bio at your root twice daily. Then your stem will be strengthened and a green old age will be assured. Well, I set about it at once. I swept all the decaying matter from my life, planted out my faculties in neat rows, and mulched them regularly, and give any slugs that dare come near short shrift. And now you see me, in my harvest time. My branches are overloaded with fruit. Here, pick one. Have one. There's more than I can eat. All that discipline, that regular effort has paid off. I am self-sufficient. I dine on my own produce. I hardly dare consider the consequences if I had lost the plot and let it be overtaken with weeds and thistles. My simple message to everyone: grow your own.
I'm about to read a passage from Loud and Clear about activism. In 2016, there is another new development, as several members of the Scottish Dementia Working Group set up a new group called the Scottish Dementia Alumni. There is a range of motivations for this. James McKillop said, "We felt there were some things we wanted to discuss that weren't being discussed. We need meetings to discuss things that concern us." The Scottish Dementia Working Group always drew up a list of priorities every year, but they seem to be the same. Why not move on? Now, the alumni is very informal, not official. There's no conflict of interest with any group, especially the Scottish Dementia Working Group. I recall it was needs-driven. The alumni were needs-driven. We needed our voice still to be heard, but our needs were different now, and we were being suppressed. We wanted to talk about our emotions more equally as campaigning. All groups will need this. We need a safe place to talk. Donna, my daughter, she gave up her time, and we searched and found a room. We don't want any interference. I'm now regaining Agnes back. I'm campaigning for what I want now, and I want to be in a safe environment to do this. Nancy, she is also a founder member of the alumni. She lives in the Black Isle. She is retiring from the Scottish Dementia Working Group in February 2018. Nancy said, "The days of Agnes, James and Edward were wonderful. The heyday, because they all had charisma. Since then, the meetings are not the same. And I feel 16 years given to the Scottish Dementia Working Group is enough. I prefer to do local things now." Inevitably, some activists outgrow the structures they themselves created and move on in different directions and into new partnerships. The alumni group builds on many, many years of experience of its members and their confidence to follow their own priorities. The entrance of the Life Changes Trust onto the scene brought many more opportunities for the voice of dementia to be heard in Scotland, and arguably greater license to be free, as Agnes desires.
Hi, my name is Donna Houston. I am the proud daughter and supporter of Agnes Houston MBE, who campaigns as a person living positively with dementia. I was very pleased with the positive impact that campaigning and meeting other activists have on my mum. When she first went to the Scottish Dementia Working Group, she was very subdued, bewildered. She had word-finding problems and she would click and point her fingers. James stood out because he said you can learn new things. It gave her immediate hope, and she's passed that hope on to others. My mum flourished, as if she grew a new brain. She made lifelong friends, and they know the new Agnes, the Agnes with dementia. She got huge feelings of self-worth, purpose, and new skills. For example, public speaking, meeting strangers, travelling internationally. She had suddenly discovered a new world and camaraderie. When I saw Tom Kitwood's flower, which represents love, acceptance, inclusion, comfort and attachment, and identity, I realised that my mum Agnes gets all of these things from campaigning. That is why I supported it. That is why I helped her plan travel and speeches. Campaigning gives you positive feedback, so you keep doing it. I believe Mum and my dad, Alan, who also has dementia, would be dead without the knowledge we got. You can choose the misery bus or the happy bus, and we chose the happy, positive bus. My mum concurs. Being a member of the Scottish Dementia Working Group was her introduction back into society, the first step on a journey and a new beginning, living with dementia. Agnes met other people with dementia. They were the only people who made her feel safe and that she belonged, and they gave her confidence back. Activists generally find their peers an enormous source of information and support, and I too reflect this. If we hadn't had the Scottish Dementia Working Group or social media, we would still be in that depressive black hole of ignorance because professionals were not expressing any hope at all.
Ron Coleman is one example of the more recent activists on the scene in Scotland who are honouring and learning from the more experienced activists and stepping up to the plate. Ron, who is in his early 60s now, is a survivor of abuse. In his 20s, he spent 10 years as a psychiatric client, over 7 of them as an inpatient. Ron hated his diagnosis of schizophrenia.
I became quite rebellious against the whole system. I was considered non-compliant.
But then in the early 90s, he gets involved in the Hearing Voices network, set up by the Dutch psychiatrist Professor Marius Rom. When he gets out of the system, Ron has a crazy few years in his 30s, learning to live. He finds his voice and becomes the first national coordinator of the Hearing Voices movement, only resigning when the movement gets funding.
I would never make an employee.
By this time, there are around 200 groups in the movement. Ron is inevitably at loggerheads with many professionals, but also sees many people as allies, including his wife-to-be or partner in crime, as she prefers, Karen Taylor. That's me, by the way. I was a mental health nurse who he met in the late 90s. Ron moves from Runcorn to join myself in Gloucester, and we have our first child, Rory, the following year. By this time, he and Marius are great friends, and Marius even adopts Rory as his grandchild. He didn't have any at that time. Myself and Ron start working together, and I'm encouraging really to put value into himself and charge properly for the work he does. We also set up many different recovery projects over the next 20 years, including recovery houses. I suppose I bring my experience of working in acute and community mental health, but before that, of being a young nurse on a dementia ward and feeling very angry about the way the patients were treated. Tea, milk and sugar all in one teapot is just one example. Doled out to everybody, whether you like sugar or not. In 2003-04, we are commissioned by Gregor Henderson, Director of the Scottish Government's innovative, internationally renowned national programme for improving mental health and well-being, to help set up the National Recovery Network. And since then, we've worked in many countries, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, USA, France, Italy, Hong Kong, Korea. And around the same time as the commissioning, we moved to Scotland and had our last child, a daughter, Ron's first and last Scottish child. It's now about 3 years ago, and we were living in Port of Ness on Lewis. Francesca notices he's forgetting things, falling asleep, getting lost, leaving the gas on. He's also losing his ability with figures. He's a trained accountant. I had been away a lot in Australia, so that's why my daughter was the one noticing. He's diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. Ron started contacting third sector organisations, but none responded. But when he sees the memory clinic nurse, she puts him in touch with Alzheimer's Scotland in Stornoway and with Deep. This leads to contact with Paula Brown at Anlanta and gets Ron and myself to the Aberdeen Deep Gathering in August 2018. The moment he met other people, he came away feeling alive. He got on Twitter and started talking to them. He could see he was still capable. He hadn't lost who he was. He loved the Dementia Diaries too. He was really fired up. This is the start of Ron's involvement as a dementia activist, or doer as he would prefer to be called.
Hi, my name's Ron Coleman and I'm a member of Deep. I belong to a group on the Isle of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides called Deepness. The section I want to read to you is the section on doism. In Scotland, there is the idea that we should be passive recipients, not active players. You face a hierarchical structure. We are so used to everything being done for us, not by us. There's no malice. They're really nice. But people should care about you, not for you. I remember at a union meeting many years ago, listening to my dad argue that we should strike in support of dockers and refuse to allow any material into the factory that came from the docks. In this moment, my dad taught me the importance of doism. The meeting we were at was meant to show solidarity with the dockers by sending them a letter of support. Instead, we took action to support them. Being an activist is about doing things, not just talking about it. We cannot expect others to do the action for us. If we do this, we allow our agenda to be colonised by others who may have very different thoughts about what we need or want. In the fifth strongest economy in the world, our lives should not be constrained by just campaigning for our needs, but also demanding a fruitful and self-determined life. The right to a life is a fundamental human right, and we should not just accept what the system tells us we need. Doism is about taking back power and not accepting a dialogue of silence that is the normal response from serviceland. And it is deeply held delusion that they are the experts. To do this, we must understand that power is never given, it must be taken. It is important that we learn the lessons from those who have struggled to have their voices heard in the past. The great activist movements of the past had doers who practiced doism to win their campaigns. We should ask ourselves, who gave women the vote? Was it men? No, women took the vote through the actions of the suffragettes and suffragists? Who gave black people their civil rights, white people? No. It was the actions of the doers like Rosa Parks, who when she sat on that bus in a white-only seat and refused to move, she took power, that was instrumental in winning the civil rights battle. Who gave gay people the right to love? Straight people? No. They took that power by coming out and being proud of who they are. In the light of history, do we really expect the system to passively give us our rights as full citizens in a society based on privilege and individualism? When we are seen as less than equal because of an illness, the answer must be no. And will be no, unless we actively fight our own fight. So like those other campaigners in the women's civil rights movement and the gay movements, we no longer allow ourselves to be victims and become victors.